Voices in the Darkness, the resistance fighters who defied Nazi tyranny. The autumn wind carried ash through the streets of Warsaw. Smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys, mingling with the grey October sky of 1940. Across Europe, millions lived under occupation, their cities transformed into landscapes of fear. German soldiers patrolled boulevards that had once belonged to free people, and the machinery of oppression ground forward with terrible efficiency. Yet within this darkness, something remarkable was taking shape. In hidden rooms and shadowed alleyways, ordinary people were making extraordinary choices. They were teachers and farmers, students and civil servants, poets and factory workers. What united them was a refusal to accept the unacceptable, a determination to resist even when resistance seemed futile. These were the men and women of the underground resistance movements, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to history, but as testaments to the resilience of the human spirit. The scope of Nazi occupation was staggering. By 1942, German forces controlled most of continental Europe, from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, from Norway's Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa. An estimated 175 million Europeans lived under Nazi rule. For many, particularly Jewish communities, Roma people, and other targeted groups, this occupation meant a death sentence carried out with industrial precision. Resistance took many forms across occupied Europe. Some activists distributed underground newspapers, keeping hope alive through the printed word. Others sheltered those hunted by the Gestapo, hiding Jewish families in attics and cellars at enormous personal risk. Still others engaged in sabotage, disrupting supply lines and communications. The most audacious joined armed partisan units, fighting the occupiers directly despite facing overwhelming military superiority. Historical research suggests that while only a small percentage of occupied populations actively participated in organized resistance, their impact rippled far beyond their numbers, inspiring others and providing crucial intelligence to Allied forces. The man who volunteered for Auschwitz. In September 1940, a Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. He would allow himself to be captured by the Germans and sent to Auschwitz, the concentration camp that had opened just months earlier on the outskirts of the Polish town of Oświęcim. Pilecki was born in 1901, during a time when Poland itself did not exist on maps, carved up between the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, defending Warsaw when his nation's independence hung by a thread. After the war, he settled into civilian life, managing a family estate near Lida, marrying a teacher named Maria, and raising 2 children. He created a dairy cooperative, organized a volunteer fire brigade, and lived the quiet life of a country gentleman. That peaceful existence shattered in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. The Polish army, though it fought bravely, was crushed within weeks. Pilecki organized a cavalry unit of local volunteers, but the battle was over before they could make a difference. Like thousands of other Polish soldiers and civilians, Pilecki went underground, joining a resistance organization called the Secret Polish Army. By the summer of 1940, rumors circulated about Auschwitz. People were being arrested in Warsaw street roundups and sent there, but what happened inside remained a mystery. The Polish resistance needed intelligence. During a meeting with his commanders, Pilecki volunteered for an audacious mission. He would get himself arrested and sent to Auschwitz, then build a resistance network inside the camp and smuggle out information about what the Germans were doing there. His superiors approved the plan and provided him with a false identity card under the name Tomasz Serafiński. On September 19, 1940, during a German roundup in Warsaw, Pilecki deliberately positioned himself to be captured. He was taken along with about 2,000 other civilians to the Light Horse Guards barracks, where the prisoners were beaten with rubber truncheons. 2 days later, on the night of September 21st, he was transported to Auschwitz and assigned prisoner number 4859. The camp Pilecki entered was already a place of systematic brutality. Guards subjected prisoners to random beatings, forced labor in brutal conditions, and psychological torture designed to break their spirits. Pilecki later wrote about having 2 teeth knocked out simply because he was carrying his registration number in his hand instead of in his teeth. The object was to convince prisoners that resistance was futile, that they were less than human, that survival depended on absolute submission. Not come to Auschwitz to submit. Within weeks of his arrival, he began identifying trustworthy prisoners and building a clandestine organization called the Union of Military Organizations. Network eventually grew to include hundreds of members. They operated with extraordinary caution, knowing that discovery meant immediate execution. The organization worked to maintain morale among prisoners, smuggled in food and medicine where possible, and most importantly, documented the atrocities occurring within the camp. Pilecki organized a system for getting intelligence reports out of Auschwitz. Prisoners who were being released, either because they had served their sentences or through other means, would memorize information or carry hidden messages. These reports made their way to the Polish underground in Warsaw, then to the Polish government in exile in London, and eventually to the British and American governments. The information Pilecki provided was among the first detailed accounts of the Holocaust reaching the Western Allies. His reports documented the mass execution of Soviet prisoners of war, the systematic starvation and murder of inmates, and eventually the development of the gas chambers and the machinery of industrial genocide. He reported that Auschwitz was not merely a prison camp, but an extermination facility, operating on a scale previously unimaginable. For more than 2 years, Pilecki lived in constant danger of discovery. He worked in various parts of the camp, at one point helping construct a villa for the camp commandant, Rudolf Höss. He witnessed unspeakable horrors, watched fellow prisoners die by the thousands, and somehow maintained his sanity and his mission. By 1943, however, the Gestapo was closing in on members of his underground organization. Several key figures had been killed, and Pilecki realized that if he was captured and tortured, he might reveal information that would destroy the entire network. He made the decision to escape. After arranging a transfer to a bakery located outside the main camp, he and 2 companions cut telephone and alarm lines, overpowered a guard, and used a duplicate key to open the bakery door. On the night of April 26, 1943, Witold Pilecki walked out of Auschwitz after spending 947 days inside hell. Minimized made his way back to Warsaw and compiled a comprehensive report about what he had witnessed. The report provided crucial evidence about the Holocaust, though tragically, Allied leaders were slow to act on the information. Pilecki proposed a plan to stage an uprising within Auschwitz, coordinated with an Allied airstrike or a parachute drop of weapons and soldiers, but his superiors deemed the plan too risky. Pilecki continued fighting. He participated in the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, leading troops in the desperate 2-month battle against German forces. After the uprising's suppression, he was taken to a German POW camp, where he remained until liberation. His story, however, would not have a happy ending. When Poland fell under Soviet control after the war, Pilecki remained loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. He returned to Poland on a mission to report on conditions under communist rule. In 1947, the secret police arrested him on charges of being a Western spy. After torture and a show trial, he was executed by a shot to the head in 1948. Prohibited, the communist regime in Poland suppressed Pilecki's story, portraying him as a traitor rather than a hero. Only after the fall of communism in 1989 was his reputation rehabilitated. Today, Poland's chief rabbi has written that when God created human beings, God had Witold Pilecki in mind. Historian Norman Davies called him a person with few peers, deserving to be remembered and celebrated as an Allied hero. The poet who jumped into darkness. Hannah Szenes was born in Budapest in 1921 into a wealthy, cultured Hungarian Jewish family. Her father, Béla Szenes, was a celebrated playwright and poet who died when Hannah was only 5 years old. She inherited his love of writing, starting a diary as a teenager and filling it with poems, observations, and reflections on the world around her. As Hannah moved through her school years, Hungary's political climate darkened. In 1938, the Hungarian government began enacting anti-Jewish laws similar to those in Nazi Germany. Jews were gradually excluded from professions, forbidden to marry non-Jews, and subjected to increasing discrimination. Hannah experienced this personally when her classmates called for a new election after she was chosen as an officer in her school literary society, simply because she was Jewish. Captivity awakened in Hannah a strong identification with her Jewish heritage and with the Zionist movement. She began studying Hebrew intensively, writing in her diary about wanting to read the Bible in its original language. In 1939, at age 18, she made the decision to emigrate to Palestine, enrolling in an agricultural school and later joining Kibbutz Sdot Yam, a communal settlement on the Mediterranean coast near Caesarea. Hannah thrived in her new home, working the land and writing poetry inspired by the landscape around her. One of her poems, written while walking near Caesarea, would become famous throughout Israel. Yet even as she built a new life, she could not forget the people she had left behind in Europe. As news filtered through about the persecution and murder of Jews across the continent, Hannah felt an increasing pull to do something, to help somehow. In early 1943, she learned about a special mission being organized by British military intelligence in cooperation with Jewish volunteers from Palestine. The plan called for parachutists to be dropped into occupied Europe to gather intelligence, help rescue Allied pilots, and assist Jewish resistance efforts. When Hannah heard about this mission, she immediately volunteered. The mission was extraordinarily dangerous. Volunteers would be parachuting into hostile territory, where they would be hunted not only as enemy agents, but also, for the Jewish volunteers, as targets for extermination. Hannah was one of 37 Jewish volunteers selected from 250 applicants. She underwent parachute training in Egypt and was assigned to the British Special Operations Executive. Upon leaving on her mission, Hannah gave a fellow parachutist a piece of paper containing a poem she had written. She wanted him to keep it in case she did not return. The poem began, "Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart." In March 1944, Hannah and several other parachutists were dropped into Yugoslavia, where they worked with partisan forces. The original plan called for them to enter Hungary to help organize Jewish resistance and evacuation efforts. However, on March 19th, Germany invaded and occupied Hungary, its former ally, after learning that the Hungarian government was considering an armistice with the Allies. This made the mission far more dangerous, but Hannah insisted on proceeding. On June 7, 1944, Hannah crossed the Hungarian border. Within hours, she was captured by Hungarian gendarmes. They found her British military radio transmitter, which she had been using to communicate with Allied forces. The consequences were immediate and brutal. For the next several months, Hannah was imprisoned and tortured. Her captors wanted the code for her radio transmitter, information about other Allied agents, and details about the resistance network. They beat her with clubs, whipped her, knocked out several of her teeth. They threatened to kill her mother, who they arrested in an attempt to break Hannah's will. Despite unimaginable pain and psychological pressure, Hannah Szenes never revealed the transmitter code or betrayed her mission. In the Budapest prison where she was held, Hannah found ways to maintain her spirit and help others. She taught Hebrew to fellow prisoners, made small dolls by hand as gifts, and counseled other inmates. Her courage became legendary among those who knew her. When she was brought before a military court, appointed by the fascist Arrow Cross regime and charged with treason, she refused to beg for clemency, stating that the court had no legal right to try her. On November 7, 1944, at the age of 23, Hannah Szenes faced a firing squad in a snow-covered Budapest courtyard. She refused a blindfold, choosing instead to look directly at those who would kill her. In her final moments, she maintained the defiance and dignity that had characterized her resistance. After the war, Hannah's mother published her daughter's diaries and poetry. In Israel, Hannah Szenes became a national heroine. Her poems are recited by schoolchildren, her face appears on postage stamps, and streets bear her name. The poem she wrote before her final mission has been set to music and is sung at memorial services throughout Israel. In 1950, her remains, along with those of 6 other parachutists who died on the mission, were brought to Israel and buried with military honors on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Hannah Szenes represents a particular kind of courage. She did not have to go. She was safe in Palestine, building a new life far from the war. She could have remained there, contributing to her community, writing her poetry, living to old age. Instead, she chose to jump into occupied Europe, knowing the odds were against her survival, because she believed that some things matter more than personal safety. The ghetto that refused to die quietly. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in October 1940 on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The German occupiers ordered all of Warsaw's Jewish residents to move into a designated area of about 1.3 square miles. Approximately 375,000 people were forced into this tiny space, separated from the rest of the city by a wall over 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire and closely guarded. Conditions in the ghetto were designed to cause suffering and death. Food rations were set at starvation levels. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded buildings, the streets filled with the bodies of those who had died from hunger and illness. Yet within this hell, cultural life continued. Schools operated in secret since education was forbidden. Musicians gave clandestine concerts. An underground archive, led by historian Emanuel Ringelblum, documented everything happening in the ghetto, preserving testimony for future generations. In July 1942, the Germans began the mass deportations they called the Grossaktion. Every day, thousands of Jews were rounded up, loaded onto trains at the Umschlagplatz transfer point and sent to the Treblinka extermination camp, about 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. The Germans told the ghetto residents they were being sent to labor camps, but as summer turned to autumn, information filtered back about the true destination. Treblinka was not a labor camp. It was a killing center. People were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arrival. Flooring by September 21st, Yom Kippur again, more than 265,000 people had been deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka and murdered. The ghetto population, which had once numbered hundreds of thousands, was reduced to around 55,000. Those who remained understood what awaited them. The Germans would eventually come for everyone. The only choice was how to face that fate. Various political and youth movements in the ghetto came together to form resistance organizations. The largest was the Jewish Combat Organization, known by its Polish acronym ZOB. Led by a 24-year-old named Mordecai Anielewicz, the ZOB brought together groups representing different political ideologies, all united by the determination to resist. A second organization, the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, also formed, representing right-wing Zionist groups. Peacefully, resistance organizations faced enormous challenges. They needed weapons, but had almost no access to them. They made contact with Polish resistance groups outside the ghetto, begging for arms and ammunition. The responses were often disappointing. Some Polish groups refused to help, others provided minimal assistance. The resistance fighters had to purchase weapons on the black market at inflated prices, collecting money from ghetto inhabitants who had little to give. Brushing by early 1943, the fighters had managed to acquire a few hundred pistols and revolvers, a couple of light machine guns, and several thousand grenades. It was a pathetic arsenal compared to what the Germans could bring to bear, but it was something. The resistance also dug bunkers and constructed hideouts throughout the ghetto, preparing for the battle they knew was coming. On January 18, 1943, the Germans entered the ghetto, intending to deport another group of Jews. This time, they encountered armed resistance. A group of Zob fighters infiltrated a column of Jews being marched to the Umschlagplatz. At a signal from Mordecai Anielewicz, they attacked the German escorts. Most of the Jewish fighters died in the battle, but the attack disoriented the Germans and allowed many intended deportees to scatter and hide. After several days, having deported only about 5,000 to 6,500 people, far short of their goal, the Germans suspended the action. Baptized the Jews of the ghetto interpreted this as a victory. It demonstrated that resistance was possible. From January until April, the underground organizations dominated the ghetto, preparing for the final confrontation. They executed collaborators and Gestapo informers. They fortified their positions, and they waited. On April 19, 1943, the eve of Passover, SS and police forces entered the ghetto to begin what they planned as the final liquidation. They expected to complete the operation in 3 days. Instead, they encountered fierce, organized resistance. When German troops advanced into the ghetto that morning, Jewish fighters opened fire from rooftops and windows. Homemade bombs exploded. Molotov cocktails flew through the air. The Germans, shocked by the intensity of the resistance, initially retreated. This was not supposed to happen. These were civilians, Jews weakened by years of starvation and disease, facing elite SS troops with tanks, artillery, and air support. Yet the Jews were fighting back. The Germans regrouped and returned with reinforcements. When street fighting proved difficult, they changed tactics. They began systematically setting fire to buildings, block by block, turning the entire ghetto into a fire trap. Jews hiding in bunkers and cellars were forced to choose between burning alive and emerging into German guns. The Germans flooded the sewers to prevent escape. They threw smoke bombs into bunkers to force people out. They showed no mercy to those who surrendered. The fighting continued for nearly a month. Jewish fighters moved through tunnels and across rooftops, striking German forces and then melting away. They knew they could not win in any conventional sense. They could not drive the Germans out or save most of the ghetto's inhabitants. But they could choose how they died. They could fight for dignity and honor. They could show the world that Jews would resist. By May 8th, German forces had captured the Zob headquarters bunker at 18 Miller Street. Rather than surrender, Mordecai Anielewicz and many of his commanders took their own lives. The battle became increasingly sporadic as Jewish ammunition ran out and hiding places were discovered. On May 16th, the German commander, SS Brigadeführer Jürgen Stroop, reported to Berlin that the former Jewish quarter in Warsaw is no more. Grazing, the cost was staggering. More than 40,000 Jews were killed or deported during the uprising. The Germans likely lost several hundred soldiers. The ghetto itself was obliterated, reduced to rubble and ash. Yet the Warsaw Ghetto uprising achieved something the Germans could not destroy. It demonstrated that resistance was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. It inspired uprisings in other ghettos and camps. It became a symbol of Jewish courage that resonates to this day. The fighters knew they would not survive to see freedom, but they fought anyway. They fought for memory, for honor, for the principle that some things are worth dying for. A fighter named Kazik Rataiser later recalled watching Germans flee in panic after a mine exploded. And I did see. Crushed bodies of soldiers, limbs flying, cobblestones and fences crumbling, complete chaos. German soldiers screaming in panicky flight, leaving their wounded behind. It was, he said, a short-lived victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The man who united the shadows. Jean Moulin was born in 1899 in the southern French town of Béziers. His father was a firm believer in republican values, and young Jean absorbed those principles. He entered politics early, rising rapidly through the ranks of France's civil service. By 1937, at age 38, he was the youngest préfet in France, the highest-ranking government official in a département. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, Moulin was serving as préfet of Eure-et-Loire, a département southwest of Paris. The German advance was swift and brutal. In the confusion of the invasion, after a German bombing raid on the town of Chartres, German officers tried to force Moulin to sign a document falsely accusing Senegalese soldiers in the French army of committing atrocities against civilians. Moulin refused. The Germans arrested him and beat him savagely, trying to break his will. He was thrown into a barn filled with the bodies of bombing victims. Fearing that continued torture would eventually force him to sign the false document, Moulin attempted to take his own life by cutting his throat with a piece of broken glass. A guard discovered him before he bled to death, and he was taken to a hospital. The wound left a scar that Moulin would often hide with a scarf, creating the iconic image by which he is remembered today. After recovering, Moulin was dismissed from his position by the Vichy government, the collaborationist regime that controlled southern France. He moved to the town of Saint-Andiol and began making contact with various resistance groups. What he found was a landscape of fragmented organizations, each with its own leadership, ideology, and methods. Some were communist, others were conservative. Some focused on intelligence gathering, others on sabotage. They were brave, dedicated, but scattered and poorly coordinated. Moulin saw the need for unity. In September 1941, he made his way through Spain and Portugal to London, where he met with General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces in exile. De Gaulle was immediately impressed. Here was a high-ranking official from the pre-Vichy French Republic, someone with credibility and knowledge of conditions inside France. De Gaulle gave Moulin a challenging assignment: return to France and unify the various resistance groups under the banner of the Free French. It was an enormously difficult task. The resistance movements had legitimate reasons for their independence. They operated in different regions, under different conditions, with different political philosophies. Some distrusted de Gaulle, seeing him as too conservative or too autocratic. Communist groups took orders from Moscow, not London. Convincing these disparate organizations to work together required diplomatic skills, patience, and personal courage. Moulin returned to France in January 1942, parachuting into the Alpes region of Provence. Using the code names Rex and Max, he traveled throughout France, meeting with resistance leaders, providing funding and equipment from London, and slowly building trust and cooperation. He emphasized that unified resistance would be far more effective than scattered groups operating independently. He warned that without coordination, the resistance might fall under communist domination, which would be unacceptable to the Western Allies. Progress came slowly, but it came. In January 1943, 3 major resistance movements in the southern zone agreed to unite, forming the United Resistance Movement. Moulin continued working to bring in other groups. His greatest achievement came in May 1943, when he succeeded in creating the National Council of the Resistance, bringing together 8 major resistance organizations, 5 political parties, and 2 trade unions. The Council's first action was to recognize de Gaulle as head of a provisional French government. It was a remarkable accomplishment, achieved through diplomacy, determination, and Moulin's personal credibility. But Moulin's success made him a target. The Gestapo was hunting him, and someone in the resistance was providing information about his movements. On June 21, 1943, less than a month after the creation of the National Council of the Resistance, Moulin attended a meeting of resistance leaders in a house in Caluire, a suburb of Lyon. The Gestapo raided the meeting, arresting Moulin and several others. His captor was SS Lieutenant Klaus Barbie, who would later become infamous as the Butcher of Lyon. For more than 2 weeks, Barbie tortured Moulin, trying to extract information about the resistance network. The torture was savage. Moulin's fingernails were torn out, his wrists and fingers were broken. He was repeatedly beaten until he was unrecognizable. Occasionally, Barbie would display Moulin's unconscious body to other captured resistance members, using him as a warning of what awaited them. Through it all, Jean Moulin never broke. He never revealed the identities of resistance leaders, never disclosed plans or operations, never gave Barbie what he wanted. His sister, Laure, later wrote that he was beaten until his head was bleeding and his internal organs were ruptured, reaching the limits of human suffering without betraying a single secret, even though he knew everything. Jean Moulin died on a train being used to transport him to Germany, likely on July 8, 1943. Hitler had reportedly wanted to meet the man who had so effectively organized French resistance, but Moulin died before reaching Berlin. His exact cause of death remains uncertain. The torture had left him so damaged that his body could no longer sustain life. Defiance, after the war, what were believed to be Moulin's ashes were eventually transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, where France honors its greatest citizens. The speech given at the ceremony by André Malraux, a famous writer and government minister, is considered one of the most powerful orations in French history. Today, Jean Moulin is honored throughout France. Schools, streets, and public squares bear his name. He represents not only the French resistance, but the values of civic duty, moral courage, and patriotism, the legacy that endures. The resistance movements of World War II were diverse in their methods, motivations, and effectiveness. Some engaged in armed combat against overwhelming odds, others gathered intelligence, saved lives through aid and rescue, or kept hope alive through underground publications. The military impact of resistance movements varied by region and circumstances, but their political and moral significance was profound. Resistance fighters demonstrated that occupied peoples were not passive victims. They showed that tyranny could be contested even by those without armies or weapons. They proved that ordinary people could make extraordinary choices in the face of evil. The intelligence they provided to Allied forces was often crucial. The sabotage they conducted disrupted German supply lines and communications. The uprisings they staged tied down troops that might have been used elsewhere. But perhaps more importantly, resistance movements kept the flame of freedom alive during Europe's darkest hours. They provided evidence that not everyone collaborated, not everyone submitted, not everyone was silent. In countries where resistance was later exaggerated or mythologized for political purposes, historical research has shown that active resistors were often a small minority. Yet their actions had an impact far beyond their numbers. Psychologists, the men and women whose stories are told here, represent thousands of others whose names we do not know. For every Witold Pilecki who voluntarily entered Auschwitz, there were countless prisoners who maintained their humanity in impossible circumstances. For every Szenes who parachuted into occupied Europe, there were many others who made quieter but equally courageous choices. For every fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, there were people who sheltered Jews at risk of death. For every Jean Moulin who unified resistance movements, there were local organizers who kept networks functioning. These stories matter because they remind us that human beings have the capacity for both terrible evil and extraordinary courage. They show us that when faced with systems designed to dehumanize and destroy, some people choose to resist, even knowing that resistance may cost them everything. They demonstrate that dignity and honor are not luxuries to be abandoned when times get hard, but essential elements of what makes us human. What courage demands. The resistance fighters of World War II did not win their battles through superior force. Witold Pilecki's reports about Auschwitz did not stop the killing. Szenes died without rescuing the Hungarian Jews she hoped to save. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising ended in the ghetto's complete destruction. Moulin was tortured to death before seeing France liberated. Yet these apparent failures were also victories of a different kind. They were victories of the human spirit over systems designed to crush it. They proved that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose resistance over submission, dignity over desperation, hope over despair. The courage these resistance fighters showed was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. It was not recklessness, but calculation, understanding the risks and accepting them for something larger than themselves. Their legacy is not merely historical, but ongoing. A reminder that in every generation there are moments when ordinary people must make choices about what they will accept, what they will resist, and what they believe is worth fighting for. Their voices echo across the decades, speaking to anyone who wonders whether individual courage matters in the face of overwhelming power. The answer these resistance fighters gave, through their actions, if not their words, is yes. It matters. It has always mattered. It will always matter. And it is up to each generation to hear that call and decide how they will respond.